Okay, Lisa, it looks like we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm Marissa. I'm part of the communications team here at REMCO Commercial Real Estate. And Lisa and I are so excited to be here with you today. We have a great lineup of information about the topic of due diligence management in commercial real estate. Lisa is the founder and principal of REMCO Commercial Real Estate, and she is a licensed real estate broker, a licensed general contractor. So she has a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so excited to be able to have her here today to talk with us about due diligence management. Lisa, how is it going today?
It's going great, Marissa, as always. And I'm really looking forward to due diligence management today. That's my favorite.
Well, that's wonderful. I can see why it is your favorite. You know, after what we've been talking about leading up to this discussion, I can see why it is. So I'm excited for everyone else to get to learn about it and just how interesting it can be. So before we dive in, I just want to tell everyone that we are live today. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box and we will answer them as they either come in, or we'll wait until we have a good point to stop and answer questions. But we'll definitely answer your questions before we get off the live stream today. So if we don't answer them in the middle of the conversation, do stay tuned to the very end, and we'll make sure that we answer them all before signing off today. All right, Lisa, it's time I pass the mic over to you. Can you start by breaking down for us what is due diligence? Let's just start talking about what due diligence is.
Oh, sure. So due diligence is the term we use for the time period in a real estate contract where you just scale through an asset to verify it's everything you think it is. The greatest part of due diligence is you get to exclusively do all this in this set period of time while retaining the right to back out penalty-free if the investment isn't what you saw fit for yourself.
Okay, so what's happening is you've found an asset, or in our case, a property, a commercial real estate property that you want to buy. And so you, prior to the sale going through, you get to this period called due diligence, in which you get to, as you say, exclusively assess the asset and make sure it's everything that offering memorandum said it was. Now, when you say exclusively, I want to talk about that a little bit. What do you mean by exclusively? Are you the only person that gets to be in this time period, or how do you get there?
Yes, you got here because you signed a purchase and sale agreement with the seller. And so you are under contract, only you.
Sorry, what was that? You're in the contract?
So you are already under contract. You signed the purchase and sale agreement with the seller.
Okay, so you're the only, so that kind of allows you this period of time to be in due diligence assessing this asset alone, and no one else can be, that seller can't be, can they be talking to anyone else in the due diligence period, or how does that work?
Sure, they can. Sometimes the contracts allow for backup offers to be received, but you cannot actually sign any other backup offer. If the current buyer is under contract and prior to the end of due diligence says, you know what, I'm not interested, then the seller can go back to those other buyers who may have submitted backup offers at the time and say, okay, the buyer A fell out. Let's start negotiating, you and I.
Okay. And then, so it's sort of this interesting period that if you sign these contracts as a buyer and you enter into this due diligence period with the seller, you get to exclusively look at this asset. I just wonder, Lisa, like what's to prevent other or what's to prevent any potential buyers from just jumping into due diligence to sort of take this asset off the market? from other competitors. Do you know what I mean? Because you're saying it's like you're not fully committed at this time. You're saying this potential buyer has the opportunity to back out at any point. So it's sort of like, what's to prevent someone from just being like, oh, we might be interested in that asset, but let's pull it off the market before anyone else gets in. And then that just gives us some time to look into it. Like, what's to prevent someone from doing that so casually?
Yeah, so a lot has happened so far. A lot of steps have occurred to ferret that out. You either saw the teaser info for the property online, or you heard about it from a broker, or something that got you requesting an offering memorandum. The information in this OM is more detailed than the teaser, and allows you really to decide whether to go after this asset or not. A lot of discussions are occurring between the potential buyer, the seller, the seller's broker. And so, there's somewhat of a vetting process going on behind the scenes too on the buyer side. And they start to get a feel for, who's serious and who's not. This buyer will either know the asset real well or, took a tour at this point. They will have then moved to submitting an offer via written letter of intent. The LOI is a very short document with, big picture, main business points of the offer, purchase price, good faith deposit. There's a timeline, the due diligence timeline, and the timeline to close. Typically 30 days of due diligence and then 30 days thereafter to close. Once the non-binding LOI, essentially the agreement and principle is accepted, these main deal points are incorporated into a purchase and sale agreement with the seller, with all the legalese and more detailed terms that you'll negotiate. So, lawyers are involved. And so you've negotiated and signed that, and you've put up a refundable good faith deposit, which is a sizable deposit. And then it's on, but it's not for the faint of heart or faintly interested buyer to keep carrying forward with that process unless they're really serious.
I see. Okay. So it definitely takes a lot to get to the due diligence period in terms of, financial investment with lawyers and even just putting down a good faith deposit, as you said. So you can't, it's not just as simple as you're just jumping into due diligence.
Right. Yep.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And it does sound like it's sort of an earned place. Like it definitely seems that when you get to due diligence, it's fantastic that you have the opportunity to assess this property exclusively, but you earned it.
Correct. And, I would say a note on due diligence. This aspect of purchasing real estate is the greatest gift ever. The ability to say, hold on, everyone else, other buyer, seller, everyone. I want to look at this asset, uninterrupted. No one can cut in at this point and decide they like it more than I do, or they're going to, up their offer and have any right to get in on this thing. This is my 30 days or, whatever's negotiated there for the world to just stop on this asset and let me evaluate this, and with full rights, and at this predetermined locked in price. And again, you do have to put down a good faith deposit, but it's refundable at this point. And during the entire due diligence period, if you don't like what you see. So to answer your question, commercial real estate is really big numbers on, so on the one hand, we really deserve this right as a buyer, but I'll tell you, it just feels like a gift to me,
I see that for sure. It's almost like time stops and you're able to really assess what you're getting into. Whereas in other areas of purchases or life, you don't really get that opportunity to really investigate something while time has sort of stopped and only you get to assess and make your decision.
Right. Yeah, you don't get to buy real estate from a store, where there's a manufacturer's warranty and the, quality and integrity of it are certified. Someone constructed this thing who's not the owner and probably is honestly several owners removed.
Sure.
And the owners in between, who knows how they managed it, what's out of line, what's been neglected. There's no warranty, like I said. You need to know everything, and you need to do it fast, and you need to have an eye, for detail. Your only risk here really is the time and money that you'll spend during this period making sure it's right for you, spending time on this asset instead of evaluating something else. And you'll spend money on inspectors and so forth. But the only reason you're here is because you really already know it is, unless some major skeleton pops out of the closet as you're given this deeper access, or enough minor surprises or discrepancies are revealed. But then
you spent the money to figure that out.
Yeah, and you honestly, what you find, any other buyer is going to find the same issues as they go through their process of this discovery as well. So, in all likelihood, then you can sit down with the seller and negotiate an addendum to the contract, based on those. Always prior to the end of due diligence, because that's that's your end point.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, though I say it's a gift, it is not playtime. You're decisioning that you're buying this thing or that you are not buying this thing. There's no second round. So
it's a serious time period for sure.
Yeah.
And, what you were saying, it really just sounds like, the investment that you would put into the due diligence, whether you buy it or not, it just sounds like potentially just the cost of doing business. It's just the cost of assessing an asset. And then one day that asset may be yours and it was worth the amount to investigate. Or, it was worth it to investigate that this asset isn't right for you, instead of, I've heard you even say many times before that, in real estate, people, they say don't fall in love with your properties, but, maybe, in this time period, it's possible to fall in love with the idea of buying this property, but that due diligence kind of continues to point out, hey, there's this little issue and there's this little issue.
Right. Exactly.
And that's probably a good place for a due diligence manager, right? Can you kind of explain how a due diligence manager comes into this scenario? I think this is a good time to sort of segue into that a little bit, because I think there's something to be said for that unbiased representative assessing the asset for a buyer. So can you kind of break down for us what a due diligence manager does for a buyer?
Sure. So the due diligence manager is, they're, collecting all the due diligence materials. They're, so an information gatherer, an analyst, a foreman, a multitasking, delegator and manager, and just, honestly, a pest. Most importantly, they're working on helping the future owner, decision whether or not to spend this, boatload of money on a huge investment. The process of due diligence it's a lot, and it places a tremendous strain on an organization for a very, intense and important time frame for a very large financial decision. I like, that you were saying, we never fall in love with our real estate, but we do. I do every time, and I think there's just a general tendency when you want something and you get pretty invested in it, to rosy up your shades a little bit. A due diligence manager is unbiased. They have no skin in the game, other than wanting, you as the potential future owner to be pleased with their job. They're not financially incentivized by the transaction, going through or not, like a broker could be. And I'm a broker, so I understand how you can really want something to work in those shoes. The due diligence manager is paid only for their time and expertise. And, this is their expertise. So, so that means they have a system, like clockwork for what is otherwise, I would say for most is, high stress, easy to have an oversight type of time, where you just can't have an oversight as an owner. And because this is what we do, we've got the right Rolodex for any resources needed through it, depending on what comes up. And I would say another major benefit for having a manager is at the end of all of this, the buyer is also not overworked and stressed while analyzing this big decision, because they've outsourced this whole thing, and then they're presented with the down and dirty, black and white, expert, unbiased, kind of one-sheeter decision tool that provides for the clear head, you want and need as a buyer. So
sure. Yes, it's certainly so. It sounds like, okay, so we have this due diligence time period that happens anytime that someone would want to purchase a property and is in that period of, just a few steps into the process. And so now they get this time period to assess the asset and make sure that they want to go through with the sale, with the purchase. And so normally, or not necessarily normally, but if you didn't have a due diligence manager, your company or you as the buyer would be performing all of this and organizing all of the pieces of due diligence, all of the things that you need to figure out and assess, and inspections, assessing what kind of loans you can get. All of that would be something that you as the buyer, or potentially your colleagues or your assistant or whatever, would be doing. And probably your company is already doing whatever it does best to make a living, which is not the due diligence of the purchase of this asset. And so that's why it can be helpful to hire a due diligence manager who comes in and can just swoop this whole scenario off of your hands and not tax your employees or not tax yourself. And the due diligence manager knows everything to look for, knows everything to look for, knows when to look for it. And we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, because we're actually going to break down the due diligence period, which is typically 30 days. So Lisa's going to take us through that in a minute of, what happens in that 30-day period. And she's actually going to, I'm just so excited about this live stream, because I think it's such a great resource for anyone, because sort of how we've talked about doing it, Lisa, is we're going to break down the 30-day due diligence period into like week segments. So week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and we're going to tell you everything that you should be looking for. So this is just such a great resource. And so this due diligence manager really comes in and has this whole system, week by week, day by day, of what to do. And I think one of the greatest assets of a due diligence manager, one of the greatest value adds of that due diligence manager is that unbiased party, is to help you kind of not have those rosy shades on if you're really kind of wanting this asset, but sort of not looking at the real meat and bones of what's going on.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, up until this point, you've, to the best of your ability as a buyer, essentially almost completed a mini, or pre-due diligence with all the information that's available from the seller and the seller's, broker's marketing efforts on this property. But it's not everything you need to be certain you're going to take on this huge financial investment, and up until this point also, it's all been under pressure, because there's competition and bidding that's been open to everyone in the market, and they've all had the right to move faster than you and get this asset under contract before you. So now you've got this asset under contract, and, this is your time to, fully, carte blanche, check it out, so that's this due diligence time frame to just have at it.
Absolutely. And so I actually, since you were talking about some of the things that the due diligence manager does, of course, before we get into the week by week play of due diligence, I did just want to let everyone into, I'm going to share my screen quickly. Let me just grab it. Okay, let's see if that pulls up. Okay, so I'm just hopping onto your website right now, remcopb.com, and I wanted to show everyone that we do have another little sense of a resource down here. It was one of our latest articles we published. What is due diligence in commercial real estate? There is a little checklist sort of content here in this article that helps you sort of know what to look for, more generally speaking, like third-party reports that you want to be going through, financial information, loan information, tenant information, property information, and service contracts. So there's a lot to look for, and so that's why we crafted this article, is to help everyone who does want to go it alone or does want to attempt going it alone, come over here to this article on our website, and you can really get a feel for everything to look for. We really designed this in order to be a resource for people that maybe might not have a due diligence manager. And then, of course, if you are interested in having a due diligence manager, that certainly can help you sort of take the edge off and also have that third party unbiased opinion. So that's at remcopb.com, and it's one of our latest articles, so you can definitely take a look there. But I'm going to go ahead and stop that screen share and let Lisa take us through finally what this due diligence period is all about. So I'll just take us through like one more little reminder of it's usually a 30-day period. It doesn't exactly have to be 30 days, but it's usually a 30-day period. And so Lisa's done this really cool thing that I don't know if every due diligence manager does, but she's broken it down into week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4. And she has this game plan about how to approach it. So without further ado, do you want to take us through that plan and what happens from day one?
Sure. And just, kind of reflecting a little bit on the list that you showed on the website, there's this clause in the purchase contract that details out everything the seller is to provide you, via documentation and access and so forth during due diligence. If you're using a standard real estate contract, it pretty much says in there most of what you need. I make sure that I have a note after that paragraph that says see due diligence addendum, and I attach my own due diligence materials checklist. And this is just to be sure I get everything I need from the seller, and that I know that the seller knew ahead of time what those requirements, were and has signed off on it. And you also want to add in the contract that the due diligence period does not begin until you have received the last of the due diligence items requested on your list.
Oh, wow.
And, I actually have my, this is the most recent one I just worked on. It's pretty terrible. It's got all my handwriting all over it.
Wow.
I attach that list to every single contract because these are the things that I need so I can hit the ground running right away in due diligence. And so now in due diligence, and I don't want to, checklist you guys to death, but
well, can I actually stop you there for a second? Because I just want to reiterate what you just said, and I think that's so helpful. So what you're saying is that before you get into due diligence, you're signing a purchase contract, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a purchase contract, and that's this kind of preceding step before due diligence. And you're saying that, hey, due diligence, setting up due diligence actually happens in this purchase contract. This is when you outline how you want due diligence to go as the buyer, and you put that into the purchase contract to say, hey, I'm interested in buying this asset. I want to move into due diligence, but this is what I want the due diligence to look like. And this is everything I need to come to me before we hit due diligence time period, because I only get 30 days to probably, based on that sheet of paper you just showed us, Lisa, you only get 30 days to look through a ton of information. And I mean, goodness, imagine if you didn't outline, that important step that, hey, I need all of this information to come before due diligence starts, or by week 1, I need certain information to be here, and by week 2, I need certain information to be here, because you don't want some of those answers coming on day 30 of due diligence. You won't have time to review them.
Right. And then, well, there's just so much I can say about that part, but I'll stay focused here.
Stay focused.
But so moving forward, into due diligence, I also have a checklist that I use. That's my, cheater kind of calendar, and it really just calendars out the analysis of the materials and the project timeline and inspections and so forth. So, not only now with the due diligence checklist do I know I have everything I need, but with this project timeline, that's really more, internal. I know I'm going to get everything done in the time frame that's allotted, because it's a lot to get done. So, heading into due diligence, the mind frame I like to start from is literally a blank slate, just forgetting everything I've seen and know, and just start rebuilding this property offering from scratch. And so my, I'll head into the, 4-week timeline. Week 1 and 2, very, very intensive. Week 1, I'm just, I call it like my underground week. I'm just tearing through, all the materials and putting in motion kind of my following week, which is more my action week. So I'll probably talk a lot about week 1 and week 2, and then you'll see we'll kind of blow through, week 3 and 4. But starting with week 1, being my, underground kind of more computer oriented, living in the Microsoft Excel world, just taking each week like a 5-day work week. I would allocate that first day for your just your kickoff day. This is where you're going to be making a lot of calls. You're going to really, first and foremost, contact the seller. Let them know you want to have a real amount of property access next week, your action week, week 2, and that you want to schedule a property tour with the seller's property manager. For week 2, day 1, have the seller put that on the books. Very intensive. You want to be in the nitty gritty of every single thing on site. And then you also ask the seller to arrange the tenant interviews for that next week. Request this gets done for day 2 and 3 of the following week, depending on how many tenants there are. You're going to still, on this first day, you're going to contact your property condition expert or, your structural engineer, see when they can do an on-site inspection for the following week. Let them know that, you've already let the seller know you need access pretty much every day next week. You're going to engage your square footage analyst and really anybody else who in your kind of mini due diligence that you've done at this point, any kind of flags you've seen, you want to engage a specialist for that to be on site the following week. Contact your insurance agent, get the ball rolling, on a bid to insure the asset, contact your lenders, and get the ball rolling on loan proposals, assuming you're not presuming you're not assuming the seller's loan. And then there's just a lot of other busy work going on day one. So a lot of calls and a lot of just, putting the ball in motion. You're going to be passing along information to all the pertinent people in the deal. So you're going to have you're going to contact your lawyer, have them review, title survey, do a title search, request a, zoning confirmation letter, a code compliance letter. They'll conduct an open permit search. And then what you also want to do, I would say for sure, I usually do this on the very first day, is you will have received in the due diligence materials a copy of all the current owners' previous third parties that they had completed when they purchased this or when they got their initial loan or refinanced it, a property condition assessment, a phase 1 environmental, phase 2 if it's moved forward. Any previous appraisal they have on hand. I would just don't bog yourself down with everything in it. Just read the initial. There's always in the beginning of those documents a 1 to 2 sheet or executive summary. And what you're really doing is looking for any flags, because that's also going to be part of your kickoff calls that day if there were any flags.
Sure.
If you're looking at the phase 1 environmental and there's an NFA on there, if you go through the executive summary of the phase 1 environmental and there is no further action required, did not need to go to phase 2, nothing unusual, then I would just not even worry about the environmental or getting one of those inspectors out there until you're ready to, until you've really signed a loan proposal and have them engage one, because you should be pretty confident that that's okay. The property condition report, no matter what it says, send your own guy or gal out there.
Really?
Even if there are no flags, this is the one expert that no matter what, I hire the same one every time. And, everybody's got a, relationship, I'm sure, with a terrific structural engineer. You send that person out regardless of what anything says, because the previous property condition assessment report that the seller has, it's current in that moment. It'll let you know if there's any serious, building envelope issues or, anything major, but maybe something serious has occurred in the 5 years since they last had the report done. So I require that in due diligence. So
that report can be quite old.
Yeah, it can be as old as their last when they acquired it, when they put the debt on it, whether that happened simultaneously or they've refinanced since, and a new one would have been required from a lender. So, but get that specialist out there week 2, no matter what.
And what about the environmental report? Is that something that can be old as well, or is it something that the seller has to get done?
That's old, but it'll really report on, none of that really would have changed unless, you're pretty familiar that something significant has changed in the area. For example, if the previous phase 1 environmental had said, everything's good, there's an NFA, no need to move to phase 2. But since that report was last completed, that a gas station has been built right next door to the property.
Okay.
Then I would engage a phase 1 guy. But
okay.
Otherwise, the environmental conditions you should be feeling pretty confident about are still the same as they were. So that really is the bulk of day 1, is just getting everything in motion.
We're still in day 1.
That's day 1. And so I know week 1's going to be a little brutal, but after this, it gets easier from here. Okay. So day 1, week 1, you're just pushing, getting everything out, and making sure every single person who's going to be on your team has everything they need. So all the due diligence materials you received, you're basically shipping all of those off to the lender, to the insurance agent, to, kind of everywhere, if you have an internal team that's scaling through this with you. So moving on to days 2 through 5.
Yes, and before we do that, Lisa, I actually just want to give a little shout out to Roy Assad, who's joining us. He just sent in a comment saying extremely helpful information. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us, Roy. We're happy to have you on, and we're so happy that this information is helpful.
Oh, good. Thank you, Roy.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. I get excited, so slow me down if you need to. So day 2, 3, 4, 5, let's call it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you get to sleep Saturday and Sunday. But day 2 is your income day. Day 3 is your operating expense day. Day 4, big ticket items, CapEx, warranty info. And day 5, you're assembling everything together. So I'll back up and just give a little detail, on day 2, income day. Income day, you're building your rent roll. You're reading through all the leases. How much do they pay? How long are they signed up for? What's my responsibility to them as the landlord? What's theirs? Are leases, full service? Am I paying for their janitorial? Are they, what's going on? What's the length of their lease? Do any of them have first rights of refusal on, adjacent space? Are there non-compete clauses or exclusive? So I know if I have a vacancy, I can or can't lease it to certain prospects because it would be a competing use for a current tenant. Any out clauses they would have, any leases that are on a month to month, because you want to know how much income you're truly underwriting and how much income your lender is going to underwrite. A lot of times the lenders won't even underwrite, the month to month leases because it's, a pretty insecure deal. Really review your aging receivables report here. You can tell usually there who's either struggling and you'll find out next week, does this highlight that something's wrong? In those tenant interviews, you'll find out, are they withholding rent because they're unhappy or there's a work order that's been pending for a while? But just kind of look for any issues there. And then at the end of that income day, you're going to prep and send income questions or, discrepancies to the seller. And then, so moving on next to the expense side, day 3, your operating expenses, same exact as the income day, just now you're looking at all the outgoings. You're reading through all the service contracts, reviewing utility bills, and just building your expense roll. Just really kind of deep dive into these expenses. What are they? What have they been? Have there been any, significant changes? I've had it where an offering memorandum reports, very low operating expenses and shows the current operating expenses, in a pro forma, but it doesn't show historicals. And you find out in due diligence when you're looking at historicals that the owner just shifted waste management down to 1 pickup per week, 3 months ago or something. And if you're only asking for 3 months of historical utility bills, you'd verify that the OM matches what you've researched, but not what this property needs, and definitely not what, historically has made it run right. So, maybe these operating expenses, and you'll know more when you get there on site and interview the tenants and everything. And then you want to review their reported, sorry, I thought you were saying Did you say something though?
No, but you might have been feeling that in my mind I wanted to say this is a lot of analysis.
a lot of analysis.
This is a lot of analysis and a lot of, I can see why you call this the undergrounder week.
Undergrounder.
I would call it like, you're going into the cave.
going into the cave. So you did your day one kickoff calls, everything. Day two, you've built your rent roll. Day three, you've built your expense roll. And, also on the expense roll side, you're looking for, through these service contracts, just to make sure that, the annual fire inspections have occurred, the backflow inspections passed, you're reviewing work order history and, looking at any deferred maintenance items and whatnot. What your property taxes will be based on your, purchase price. Same with insurance, though you don't have that bit in yet. But at the end of this day, you're going to do exactly what you did at the end of your income day. You're going to prep and send expense side questions, or discrepancies to the seller. And then moving on to your final, real discovery day is day 4, CapEx. These are, like I was saying, big ticket items. You're looking at all the capital expenditures that the previous, or not previous yet, but the current, seller has completed. Any future capital expenditures that they've budgeted, items they're aware of, items that need attending to, items that they would take care of if they were going to hang on to this property. And then you're looking through the permit history on the property, reviewing any warranty info, making sure those warranties are, transferable. Sometimes that's with cost, sometimes, without. And then this is where, like on the first day where you reviewed the executive summary of your, the previous third-party reports, this is where you are reading through the property condition report, reading through the phase 1 environmental report, just because that'll kind of let you know what happened to that point, what the previous property condition inspector suggested should be done. And some of them are suggestions, some of them aren't requirements. And then knowing the property and going on the tours that you've been on at this point, knowing what the seller's done, you now build your own capital expenditure budget. You're sort of below the line item costs. And then at the end of this day, same thing, prepping the big ticket expense item questions to the seller and sending them off. And so as you've done this on your income side, your operating expense side, your big ticket, CapEx item side, you're kind of backfilling that information as you get responses back from the seller. And day 5, you're then taking all your information, rent roll, expense roll, and capital expenditure budget. You want to, prep your own internal operating statement, your own internal pro forma, your own essential appraisal of this property. And then you're going to review that against the previous appraisal on the property from the actual third-party appraiser. You're going to review this against what you saw in the offering memorandum. And then, again, prep and send any final financial questions to the seller. And sorry, I would just, at the end of this week, on the financial side of things, you kind of already know at this point whether you're buying this thing or not. It's unless some major, new item or surprise is revealed in the action week, which can very much be the case. But you've really got your mind wrapped around this property from a financial standpoint here.
Okay, so week 1 is going to be a really good sense of if you're going to go forward or not. Yep. It's kind of going to be maybe like a little bit of the deal maker or breaker. One of the things I wanted to clarify, Lisa, in case along the explanation anyone forgot or didn't quite grasp, or perhaps in case anyone's tuning in, I'm kind of in these later minutes of this live stream. all of these reports that you're creating as either the buyer or the due diligence manager, all these reports that you're creating in week one, like your rent roll that you're making as the buyer or the due diligence manager, the CapEx budget or operating expenses, all of those things, you all are getting those existing documents from the seller, but you, in your experience, Lisa, have determined that creating them on your own as if you didn't have them is an important step in due diligence. And then once you create them all from the ground up as if you didn't have them, even though you do from the previous seller, then once those reports that you've made are finally ready, then you're going to look at them and compare them against the seller's same reports and see if there are any discrepancies. Ideally, those reports should match pretty within a window, they should match. But if there's anything really standing out, then that's when you're going to be calling the whole exercise of this to call out any of those discrepancies to the seller and say, hey, what's going on over here? Why am I so off, when I run these numbers?
Right, exactly. So I just think that's the best way to go about it. I would just say trust no one. It's too big of a financial decision. And like you said, you should pretty much tie out at the end. There can be oversights. Maybe they forgot to, ship you one of the leases, and so your rent rolls off. You rebuilt it. You see what's off. Oh, okay, seller. This is what it is. I'm missing the lease for unit 2. Send that over. They say, oh, geez, forgot it in the file. Here it is. Here's unit 2. You drop it in your information. Now everything ties out. So there are general oversights like that. Sometimes the offering memorandums. Who knows what programs each of the brokers are using to drop the information in there. There could be a typo. And I'm guilty of it myself, where you look at something and it, and even though you're looking at it, you see it as what but you're missing the glaring herring that the number's not what it should be or something. So I just rely only on, I just feel if I do everything, the broker's done everything to drop all the same information in the OM, the appraiser's done it, but it's a little dated from the previous time they were engaged, and the seller gives you all their information. That's a lot of people who I just feel like it really weeds out, any type of issue.
Yes.
And then it's just a good exercise because you really know the asset here. And even though you're in your, I like how you call it a cave week, even though you're in your cave week, in general, I would just say get out from behind your desk, once or twice during cave week and just do, loops or pass-bys at the property, just once every few days, keep, familiarizing and connecting, connecting the dots and whatnot. So week 2, then, and again, this one's a lot less information heavy. But so I'll just kind of now, blow through the rest. But week 2 is action heavy. This is where you're going to be meeting with the seller's property manager on site. Any answers that you did not get from the questions you sent to the seller or the seller's broker the previous week, you can work on getting those answers from the property manager there. You can eyeball some of the answers to questions just by being on site and given full access. It's also a good time to interview this property manager. Maybe the seller is interested in not keeping this property manager on their staff because they're no longer going to have this property, or maybe you come to an arrangement there that this property manager will stay on with you during the transition, or maybe you have your own. But Anyway, just it's a very intensive, thorough tour day one with that property manager. And then day 2 and 3, or just day 2, like I said, depending on how many tenants there are on site, this is just maybe some of the best information you'll get on the property is during these tenant interviews.
Sure.
You will be able to get a feel from them of just their general sentiment on the property. Oftentimes at the end of these tenant interviews, so much information comes forward that sometimes we know more than the seller even knows about his own her own property. It's you might find out that a tenant's really interested in expanding and needs more space, and they're thinking about leaving because there's more space down the road, when really there's a vacancy on site that we can accommodate this need. Or maybe there's another tenant whose lease goes out 5 more years, but he really needs to downsize to make things work. Okay, well, maybe I can expand Joe, I can decrease Sally, I can, make a lot of people happy regardless of what the lease says, and just amend them,
Right.
when it gets under your ownership. But really good information. You'll find out why there were any issues on the receivables report that you were looking through during your underground week. Day 3, you'll really kind of tidy up any kind of interviews that you hadn't completed. You'll be meeting with the seller's rep will be meeting with your property condition inspector. They'll be going through it. Your square footage analyst will be out there, and then you'll want to meet on site. Day 3, day 4 with your lenders. They'll want to put their feet on the ground there as they're going through their underwriting process. And then riddled through this week, and that's really the bulk of the week, at least verbally. But through this week, there's a lot of emailing back and forth, calling back and forth, questions that come up, or answers still piling in from last week's questions. Every time you get a document that, let's say that they'd slipped the seller's mind, or like we talked about that missing lease, unit 2 or something. Anytime you tweak your internal information, you got to make sure that you're getting all this out to the lenders, and all this out to the attorneys, and all this out to the insurance agent, any third parties that you've engaged, because they all need the same information too. So it's just working a lot in lockstep and being mindful of what everybody needs, and that everybody has the current information, that you have. So, lots of calls with the seller and the seller's team, your attorney, coordinating lender information and so forth. So day, 5, the end of week 2, just take a nap. But really then you're, like I said, at the end of week 1, financially whether or not this thing is what you want. At the end of week 2, in your mind, what maybe some of the bigger picture items are, some of the things that need some real thought. You have a really good feel for the property. You probably start processing, who's going to be my asset manager, how am I going to, implement this asset into the portfolio? Is this the best use of my money? Is this the right thing to be chasing? I've got a few weeks left of due diligence here, but in my process of due diligence, I'm good now. I'm really, really in good shape. I'll be waiting on formal reports to come back the following week, but I already really know what everything's going to look like. Like my property condition inspector, who was out week 2, he might not even get me his report prior to the end of due diligence, but I've been on the horn with him at this point,
Right.
Tell me tell me what I need to know.
Sure. So this is week 1 and week 2.
Right.
And these are the more intensive weeks. And I think, we're going to slow down and it's going to be easier in week 3 and week 4. But that's why we really took the time to go through what happens in week 1 and week 2. So everyone tuning in, don't worry, things are going to get easier week 3 and week 4. But I can already see, if you're tuning in and you want to learn about due diligence, you want to kind of try to navigate it, or even just understand it yourself or navigate it yourself. This is a great resource, this live stream, because if you're listening to Lisa, you can just take a little notepad and be like, okay, week 1, what did she say? Okay, pause, rewind. Okay, that one all needs to happen in week 1. Here's what needs to happen in week 2. So I definitely encourage anyone listening in to go ahead and do that. I think that this is really a great resource. So, all right. So just to recap, week 1 is really cave week, underground week. It's when you're getting you're going through all of the information that you have, and you're creating spreadsheets upon spreadsheets, recreating all of your reports, and comparing them with the same reports from the seller and making sure that everything jives out financially. And Lisa also said that in week 1, this is kind of where all right, this is all checking out, or I don't know if I'm really into this property anymore, based from a financial perspective. Then week 2 is when things kind of are a little less behind the computer, and you're starting to get on site with the property, and you're walking around the property with various individuals. You're meeting the current property manager, and you're also meeting with all the tenants. So you're on site and you're performing all the on-site reviews, the visual assessments, week 2. So now we're about to move into week 3 and week 4, right?
Right. And I'll go fast. I just looked at the time. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's okay if we go a few minutes over. Anybody can drop off.
Okay.
But yeah, let's go through week 3 and week 4. And we knew that week 3 and week 4 were going to be shorter and easier anyway. So.
Okay. So and I think I'm forever going to call week 1 cave week now. I love that. So, cave week, action week, on-site week. So week 3, you're fine-tuning everything. And week 4, I would just say final, negotiations, if any are required. So week 3, where you're fine-tuning anything or tying up any loose ends, really, if the property condition inspector, has gone through and said, okay, the roof's in decent condition, but it's serviceable, or there's, cracking in the stucco, I think it's serviceable. Maybe you could just patch and paint there, but you might want to get a stucco guy out there just to kind of make sure there's not an issue, behind it. Who knows
Sure.
how in depth that could get. Anything that was verbalized from the inspectors as needing further potential action. You will have had the conversation with the square footage analyst from the previous week. So you'll know if anything's off there with square footage. But, these reports will probably start, coming in this week. And again, you're then just redistributing them to all the people who need them. You're thinking about any service contracts that you might want, canceled, or like I said, do you want their property manager to hang on with you or not? Maybe get a proposal from that property manager. You'd probably be in receipt of the term sheets, at this point from the lenders, even though, again, you'll know because you never stop talking to these people, because if, you're like me, you get into this process and you're just compulsive, you just you don't let anybody rest until you have everything you need to know. But the actual papers will be, the term sheet, not full blown loan proposals, but you'll know what the loan's going to look like. So even though it seems like, okay, wow, I have 5 days now in week 3 where I'm just fine tuning things. that can be a very intensive time, or it can be, a time where, and I'll probably say the same things about, week 4 and then, negotiating any final items. If you feel you're in pretty good order, you can move forward with the other items that you would typically handle post due diligence, because that's its own intense period that you can always benefit from a head start on. But really, week 3 and week 4, do you want any special rights that aren't covered in the contract now from the end of due diligence till closing? If there's a vacancy and we lease it, who's responsible to pay that commission, the seller or me? Is that covered in the contract? Or, do I have the right to lease this property if I know I'm moving forward with it? Now all my deposits are hard money. But you just never, even if you know that this asset should be your asset and you want it, never waive the balance of due diligence unless there's some kind of real motivation to do so. For example, if there's a serious price discount in exchange for the waiver of the due diligence remainder, maybe you tally up all your items that were these, just minor items you found through the due diligence process, and you say, okay, this is about $5,000 that really wasn't reported on the deferred maintenance list. Okay, no biggie, on a $10 million deal or something. But now there's another one that's 11,000. Now there's something else that's 75. Now there's something that's, and you kind of say, look, I'll waive the balance of due diligence, take $250,000 off the price, and let's call it a day. And then I'm moving forward with this thing. There's no more negotiation, and so. In that case, yeah, you can give away your time, but for no other reason, don't ever end due diligence early without something in exchange for it. If you find a problem, this would be the time, week 4, where either you need to request an extension of due diligence, like due to an unforeseen property issue. That any buyer would run into, let's say that was, just a surprise to all, or any addendum to the PSA that becomes necessary for clarification or a shift in agreement. This is where that's done, because at the end of this final week 4, this is where your additional deposit is due. And then both your deposits, that initial good faith deposit you put up, and now this additional deposit, both become one, and they're both hard and non-refundable at this point. So this is this would be I guess where I have to draw the line at the end of due diligence. I kind of want to move into the closing piece of the transaction now, but that would complete your due diligence timeline.
Okay. Wow. So we've gone through the 4 weeks. The 2 weeks definitely are more intensive. And then those final 2 weeks are a little bit easier. But as Lisa's saying, don't waive those final 2 weeks if, for any reason. Don't say, okay, we're good. We don't need the extra 2 weeks. Let's go through with the purchase. Don't do that unless the seller is prepared to give you some sort of discount for just going through with the transaction quicker. Lisa, I guess, we are now about 5 minutes over, so, which isn't bad. But I do want to just end on maybe a question for you. And let's just jump right to maybe the biggest ticket question, which is, what do you think overall, and in your experience, in your perspective, is the biggest problem that having a due diligence manager solves for, a buyer?
I would say, I think we addressed a little bit of this at the beginning, where we were talking about, just that unbiased opinion.
Okay, sure.
And just the removal of the stress that is placed on a buyer, where it's a lot to do. And if you do it every day, you just know it like the back of your hand. And if you don't do it every day, it's you can just see people's shoulders and their ears, and writing. And so it's just really easy for a due diligence manager to get through all this, ask for what they need, get what they need, not be too I don't know, just affected by the intensity of it. And then at the end of it, get this information in front of the buyer, who's not, overly worked at this point, or invested in this, all this, project. It can, like I was saying, can kind of get emotional. You can almost want it so much that you start to lose sight of the fact that maybe it's not the right choice at all. And so when that person can stay real clear and rested, 30 days later, they can see the black and white, and it just becomes, much easier way to make a decision. It's the way I would want to make that decision.
Certainly. Well said. Yeah, that even just the very last few words that you said there, just think of the mentality that you want to have when making that decision, and then decide, whether, how you want your due diligence to go, if you want a due diligence manager, if you want to go it alone. And you certainly can both ways. And, there is this video hopefully will be a resource for those. And also, feel free to check REMCOPB.com, and you'll see a couple articles about due diligence and how to navigate it,
right?
Different ways that you can. So I just have to say, thank you for joining us today, Lisa. Thank you for imparting all of this, tenured knowledge. This is definitely acquired knowledge that took, decades of your experience, and I know that. So to summarize it into an hour on the topic of due diligence is definitely appreciated, and I think we all have a much better understanding of it today.
Great. It's a great topic for me. I love this part of a transaction. I really do.
Yeah, it's very focused, and you're a very focused individual. So
yep.
How you like it. It's very intensive, and it takes someone who really is very thorough to get through it. So, well, without further ado, I think we'll close here today. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks again, Lisa, and we'll catch you all next time. We're gonna take a little break on live streaming throughout the holiday season. I hope everyone enjoys your holidays that are coming up, and we'll be back online soon enough. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Okay. Thanks, Marissa.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Bye.